Thanks for your patience. And it's great to be able to welcome you here tonight at the Yunus Emre Institute. It's actually my first time here, so I'm quite excited to be here and see all the things that the Institute does. And it's incredible that it's actually very close to my university and a place that I think I'll have to come to more often now that I know that it's here. But I can tell you a little bit about the Institute as well. I've been given a sheet to read. So this is the Republic of Turkey's Cultural Institute. You may know this, but in case if you don't, then I'll sort of fill you in. Established in 2007, it has over 90 branches worldwide. Through cultural diplomacy, the Institute aims to increase awareness of Turkish culture, support the learning of the Turkish language, and stimulate greater exchange in the fields of arts, culture, science, education, which is great for our topic this evening. Since it opened in 2010, the Yunus Emre Institute has been improving connections between Turkey and the United Kingdom culturally. And tonight we will have, and this event is organised within the scope of the Arts and Culture Lecture Series, which has been going here since 2017. And I learned that there are actually sessions that happen every week, which is quite phenomenal as well. And it's fantastic to be able to be in conversation with Diana Darke this evening, and to be able to sort of hear Diana speaking about her latest book, Islamesque. And it's great because I spoke to Diana a few years ago about Stealing from the Saracens at the Brighton Festival, and I was introduced to her work then and found it completely fascinating. And it's fantastic to see that this new book has also, that she's also come out with this new book, which again is looking at the interconnections between the European architectural world and how that's been informed and influenced by the Islamic. And it's something that we're often all kind of aware of in various ways, kind of approximate ways, but to be able to have it outlined and explained in the kind of detail that Diana does is really a treat. And also opens up a whole series of questions and intrigues for us to look into further. And that's what I'm really looking forward to sort of being able to do this evening. And we're going to have, Diana will do a presentation of the work, and then we'll have a Q&A. And then there is refreshments afterwards. So for that we can we'll be able to sort of talk more then. So I think I'll hand over, Diana, and then we can get going.
Okay. Yeah, by all means. Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here again, because I came about 18 months ago maybe to talk about Stealing from the Saracens, the first book that I wrote about how Islamic architecture shaped Europe. And at that time I didn't have any plans to write another book on the subject at all, but this second book sort of grew organically out of the first book. So there's actually no overlap. It's not the same material rehashed or anything like that. I didn't even look at the material in Stealing from the Saracens when I wrote this. So it's all completely new discoveries, if you like, that have come out of the new research that I started. And I'll explain as I go along why I began that new research and what actually happened to trigger me in that unexpected direction. So you may remember that Stealing from the Saracens is essentially the Islamic backstory of Gothic architecture, and that's the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral is the front cover, because Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's, said that he used Saracen vaulting in the dome of St. Paul's because it was the best. End of story. You know, you're going to go for the best. You've been commissioned to do a massive prestige project. You're going to always use the best. And that's a kind of theme, really, that you can follow through. So Christopher Wren said what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. So that's what that book is exploring, if you like. But this book is completely different, because what I'm looking at here, and I've made up the word Islamesque as a direct challenge to the concept of Romanesque. Because Romanesque architecture is what in European art history language comes before Gothic. You know, they like to have these neat labels that first you have the Romanesque and then you have the Gothic, as if it's sort of nice little compartments like that, which of course it isn't at all. But so in the broadest possible way, Islamesque is a challenge to Romanesque, and it's giving the Islamic backstory of what gets called Romanesque architecture. And in this country, Romanesque is also called Norman architecture. And what this led me to was the craftsmen themselves. This is what I wasn't expecting. The craftsmen. Who were these people who built these extraordinary, astonishing buildings? So these are two Romanesque cathedrals in this country, Ely Cathedral on the left and Lincoln on the right. And these, 1,000 years ago, who on earth was capable of building this sort of astonishing buildings? That nothing like this existed before. And the conclusion I came to during my researches was the timing here coincides exactly with the collapse of the Cordoba Caliphate in what is today Spain and Portugal, and the collapse of the Emirate of Sicily, which the Normans then conquered. So the Sicily was under Islamic rule for nearly 300 years, about 250 to 300 years. Spain and Portugal were under Islamic rule for nearly 800 years. And that was at the time when the Islamic world was at the absolute peak, its golden age. The degree of learning that was coming out of Baghdad, the scholarship, all the court that was encouraged, the House of Wisdom. I'm sure you know all of these things. So the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries were the absolute peak of all this learning, when the Islamic world was way ahead, about 2 or 3 centuries ahead of anything in Europe. So my argument essentially is the only people who could have built this sort of thing actually were Muslims or Arabized Christians schooled in the Islamic tradition is the phrase that I use. And I'm going to explain why I've come to that conclusion now. So what happens, images like this start to appear in European literature. So this is the frontispiece of a French Bible showing God as architect of the universe. With his pair of compasses there. So what this tells us is that the whole concept of geometry and the power of geometry is completely new in Latin Christendom at this time. It did not have a tradition of geometry in this early medieval period. Until then, images like this start to appear, where clearly the power of geometry in creating new buildings is understood in Latin Christendom for the first time. And this is early 13th century by now. But the only place on European soil where geometry was in regular use at a very, very high level was in Sicily and in Spain and Portugal under the Caliphate of Cordoba. And this is the dome in front of the mihrab in the Cordoba Mesquita, where the ribbed vaulting of the dome, this is 1,000 years old, 1,000 years old. Nothing like this exists in Europe anywhere at this time. This is a remarkable, astonishing piece of geometry. And I think it was 2017, a pair of Spanish structural engineers got permission to go and do a structural survey of it, and they produced a report saying that they were completely astonished at the level of geometric perfection that this dome represented, the very advanced understanding of geometry, and it has never needed structural repair in its entire 1,000 years of existence. And at the back of the Cordoba Mesquita are all these masons' marks, the names of the people who built the Cordoba Mesquita. This is 10th century we're talking now. This is the extension, the 10th century extension of the Cordoba Mesquita, which begins in the 8th century, and then in the 9th and 10th century it has extensions built. And when you look at these masons' marks, they're almost overwhelmingly Arabic names. names of the masons themselves, which shows that in the 10th century, these masons were literate. At a time when in Europe, in Latin Christendom, nobody was literate except a tiny proportion of top clergymen. The population at large was not literate. Even noblemen and aristocracy were barely literate at this time. But because learning was so endemic, if you like, it was just encouraged. The Hadith, seek knowledge even unto China. Every school in Al-Andalus had every mosque had a school, and so by the end of the 9th century, the population was essentially literate and numerate. Again, centuries ahead of anything in Europe. So what happens then is, the Cordoba Caliphate collapses over the course of the 11th century, and in Sicily as well, the emirate there collapses as the Normans come in and invade, and so gradually these regions become under new leaders. So the Christians take over these areas, but of course they use the craftsmen who are already there because they're the best. They are unquestionably the best, and so you start to find then structural, the same ribbed vaulting starts to be used in early cathedrals in France. And this is the earliest example. This is in Caen, in Normandy, where in the dome there you have the ribbed vaulting that starts to appear. And then the Normans bring it into this country, where you have the ribbed vaulting appearing for the very first time in Durham Cathedral. And Durham is way ahead of its time, with pointed arches, and it's built incredibly fast. That's another signature thing of Islamic architecture at this time, is the sheer speed with which they were able to build, because they were at the top of their game. These were incredibly skilled and experienced people for whom the best will work very efficiently and very quickly. And so Durham Cathedral was built in less than 4 years at that time. So it was astonishing. Nothing like this it was definitely nothing to do with local craftsmen, because how could it have been? The local people didn't have that knowledge. So the fire at Notre Dame is a key part of the story, if you like, that triggered me to be writing about all of this in the first place. It's what really spurred me to write the Stealing from the Saracens book, because again, the reaction of the world to the fire at Notre Dame was so massive. I was just astonished when people were talking about our national identity going up in flames, from a secular nation like France. It just seemed all wrong somehow that they were suddenly appropriating all these styles as if they were French, when in fact pretty much every element in that cathedral has come in through the Islamic world into Europe. And that's the vaulting in Notre Dame, which again is even more sophisticated, because this is a little bit later now. So of course it becomes increasingly sophisticated as the experimentation develops. But metal, so I've explained about how the masonry was astonishingly advanced with the stone vaulting of the cathedrals, but not just masonry and stone masonry. The other field that was completely dominated by the Islamic world at this time was metalworking. And in the fire at Notre Dame, they found, when the vault began to collapse, that there were these metal tie rods at the tops of the walls, like staplers, holding it together. And this is almost certainly one of the reasons why the walls didn't collapse in the fire. And this metalworking in Al-Andalus, the Arabs, when they came in, revived the mining industry. Of course, the Romans had mined here before, but then the Visigoths, who were there for 300 years before the Arabs came in, they didn't mine. They just, they didn't do any kind of mining, so all of the mines lapsed. But this is a mine that's still in use now, and the mines, so many mines across Spain and Portugal, still have their Arabic names, which makes it very clear where this knowledge came from. But not only that, they in reviving the metalworking, what they also did they had the technology and the understanding how to do this so efficiently. So this is an illustration of a pump of Al-Jazari, which, when you're digging down into the earth to get iron ore out, you have to often pump out water, you have to pump out noxious gases, you have to pump in clean air, and the Arabs developed this technology and became, the metalworking industry therefore became way more advanced than anything else in the Mediterranean, and became famous then as the top quality metalworking. And so in cathedrals then, all across Europe, in this period that's termed Romanesque, as if it sort of pops out like some miracle birth, around the year 1100. This is what art historians tell you, that around the year 1100 there was this incredible sort of outburst of cathedral building, and suddenly all this kind of stuff revived, But how on earth could that possibly be, It's because new people came in at the top who had the money, and top craftsmen from the Islamic world were recruited in to build new cathedrals. And so here you have the stonework. This is the entrance to a Cistercian monastery in Germany called Maulbronn. It's still there. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's well worth a visit. It's beautifully arranged. And so you've got the stonework, you've got the metalwork on the door, but then you've also got the woodwork. This is the third element that you need in construction. If you're going to dominate the construction industry, which they did, and academics have researched this and shown that the whole of the construction industry was dominated by the Islamic world at this time in Europe, because they were just so advanced. So using water wheels, the technology that had been brought in from Syria, from Hama, where water wheels were again just as old as the hills. And here was this one is being used to drive a forge for metalworking. All this technology, they were way ahead of anything that existed in Europe. And then these are just as some examples of the very, very advanced woodwork in the ceilings so this one on the left is the ceiling, the restored ceiling of the Cordova Mesquita. And so you can see the quality of the woodwork, the way in which everything is in panels, and the use of this beading, this pearl beading as a frame often running around is a recurring theme that you find again and again and again in Islamic decorative patterns. And on the right is a Fatimid, so this is again 10th century, very elaborate piece of decoration from one of the Fatimid palaces in Cairo. It was the Fatimids, obviously, who founded Cairo, and they were very, very keen to promote craftsmen. They were huge patrons of the arts, and so artwork that was done under the Fatimids is of an extremely high level. And again, they summoned in the best from wherever they could find it. They summoned in the best and produced some exquisite ivories and woodwork and rock crystal and beautiful ceramic dishes. So this level of woodwork, you then see it. Not many examples remain because obviously wood is very prone to fire, but these are two examples that still exist of wooden painted medieval ceilings in cathedrals. So on the left here, this is Peterborough Cathedral in this country, and look how geometric the arrangement is. Lozenges, the use of lozenges is a very Islamic pattern, used again and again. Frames, all these frames around the edges of the lozenges, and a very good book has been done on the renovation of this ceiling in Peterborough, where they describe the techniques that the carpenters would have used. They can analyze all of this now, and those techniques are exactly the same as what was being used in the ceiling of the Cordova Mesquita. On the right is one of the other very few examples that remains in Europe. There are only 4 in the whole of Europe. And so these are 2 of them. This one is in Hildesheim in Germany. And again, look at how geometrically formed that is in frames, using circles, lozenges, quatrefoils, circles. I mean, the whole thing has been put together in a very geometric fashion. This is just an example of how lozenges are used in Islamic art. This is the great mosque of Kairouan around the mihrab, where decorative lozenges are placed, you know, around the holiest part of the mosque, where the decoration tends to be concentrated. So that's just an overview of how the areas you need for construction is stone, metalwork and woodwork. That it was the Islamic world at that time in Spain and Portugal and Sicily that were the absolute peak, you know, centuries ahead of anything that existed in Latin Christendom. And so, but how do we know that there were actually Arabs or Saracens, to use the language of the time, working on cathedrals in this country? And my argument is that the evidence is embedded in the buildings themselves. As you learn to train your eye, the proof is there staring you in the face in the buildings. But on top of that, occasionally there is further evidence like this. So these are Arabic numerals carved into the rafters of a manor house in the 1220s. And numerals like this, Arabic numerals, were found in the roof timbers of Salisbury Cathedral. It was an accidental discovery in a dendrochronology report, so they wanted to date the trees in order to get an exact date for when the roof timbers were built in the cathedral, and they dated it to the 1220s. Now, Arabic numerals were not in use in this country until the 1500s. So who is it who's using Arabic numerals like this to mark up they're used as assembly marks, you know, to mark up the right and the left to make sure that each piece of wood is put in the right place. So, I mean, the quality of the workmanship in the top of Salisbury Cathedral is so high. This is it viewed from underneath. It's just an astonishingly high level of workmanship, and that's commented on by people, and they marvel at it. But somehow they never make that leap to say, well, this can only have been done by Arabs using their own numbering system. They always try to explain it as, well, they must have been Italians who were just very advanced for that time and somehow or other knew how to use Arabic numerals. But I personally don't think any of that stands up to scrutiny. And the same thing happens again at Wells Cathedral. This is the famous west front of Wells Cathedral. It's meant to have the absolute top-level sculpture of any cathedral anywhere in this country. There were 400 statues across this front, and 300 of them remain. And up here in what's called the resurrection tier, so that shows people emerging from their tombs to discover whether they're going to heaven or hell. It's actually quite amusing the way it's been, the way it's depicted, because all the people are naked, and some of them are wearing a crown, and some of them are wearing a mitre. So, and it's as if the craftsmen were sort of almost playing with it and sort of deciding, right, who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, because up there nobody can see anyway, it's so far from the ground. But Arabic numerals were found on the base of the statues there. And they found those in 1888 in an early restoration. Again, an accidental discovery. As the statues were taken down, they found these Arabic numerals. And again, it dates to the 1220s. So how on earth is that explicable? And the quality of the workmanship there everywhere. And look at these quatrefoils. You've got the pointed arches everywhere. You've got interlocking arches. And the quality of the actual statuary and the drill work, as it's called. Again, a wonderful book has been written by somebody who sadly died last month, Jerry Sampson, on Wells Cathedral, and he knew it intimately. He was the cathedral archaeologist and spent his entire life, researching all of these things. And what he worked out about these Arabic numerals was that what happened, so the masons were working very fast, and they were ahead of the rest of the building going up. And then the bishop died, and there was a dispute between rival bishops about who would take over. and they couldn't resolve the dispute, and it became a court case that had to go to the papal curia in Rome, and it took 15 years to solve, by which time, of course, the masons had moved on. The speculation is that they moved on to Glastonbury because that's how the timing fits. But the extraordinary... So then, after 15 years, the building work resumed, and these statues for the resurrection tier had to be put back, or had to be put for the first time up in their niches. But the local builders didn't recognize what the symbols meant. These were just incomprehensible hieroglyphs to them. So they put them in all the wrong niches, and it would always puzzle people why the Arabic numerals didn't run in sequence. But what Jerry Sampson explains is that it was basically because the local people didn't understand where to put them, so they even tried to adjust the niches to make them fit. But what he does through an incredible piece of detective work is work out that if we accept that these were correctly labelled statues done by Arabs using Arabic numerals, and had they been put in the correct sequence, they would have fitted perfectly in all those niches. And to my mind, that's pretty strong proof, actually, that these people were Arabs working at the top of their game. And this is another detail of the front of Wells Cathedral with the this is the main entrance with that double, very typically Islamic double door, double window, the pointed arches, the quatrefoils, the lozenges. All of it, is incredibly beautifully decorated. And this is still in Wells now. This is the chapter house, which is built up above the undercroft. So again, the understanding of geometry that's required to build this, and these stylized palm trees holding up the vaulting of the ceiling. Very, very elegant, the slender columns, all of these things which are so reminiscent of Islamic architecture, and which, of course, then also we see in Cambridge now, with the Cambridge Central Mosque, again uses this style of stylized palm trees holding up the ceiling. Other technologies which start to appear are to do with earthquakes, actually, according to a study that was written within the last 10 years or so, that styles. So this is the Qalat Beni Hamad in modern Algeria. So this is 10th century, and this idea of as it goes up, the building becomes lighter and lighter, which makes it more earthquake resistant because the weight is more concentrated at the bottom. And then you get towers like this, which are thought to be modelled ultimately on towers like Qalat Beni Hamad in northern Italy, in Lucca, where the windows get more and more as you go up, so the building is getting lighter. And right at the top, if you see that pattern along the top there, that is a pattern which you see in mosques and ribats in northern Africa, which we'll see again. I'll point it out the next time it pops up. Another earthquake feature is these what are called joggled voussoirs. So this on the left is Bab al-Nasr, one of the Fatimid gates in Cairo, and you see how the lintel there is, instead of just being pieces of stone across, they're made into sort of like a jigsaw, so that they're locked in together, and that is a very Islamic technique, which of course strengthens the arch underneath. It makes it very strong, so if there's any movement in the ground, it will still stay there. And the only cathedral I've found in this country so far that actually uses this joggled voussoir is in Rochester Cathedral, that row along here holding up the sculpture in the tympanum. So it's very important. This is the main west front entrance. So this is the most decorated part of the cathedral. So it's very important to have this as strong as possible. And these, when you look very closely, when you're standing there in person, you can see how they've all jigsaw pieces stuck together, very with hugely difficult and very expensive stonemasonry to achieve. Then we get to glass. Now, this is a representation of alchemy on the front of Notre Dame Cathedral. And again, alchemy, well, the name tells you everything you need to know. You know, our word chemistry comes from that. Anything with al at the beginning, alchemy is from the Arabic. So the whole idea of blending different metals and using glass. Of course, glass, Syria was the world leader in glass at this time. Damascus was the center, Mesopotamia and other parts of Syria is where all the glass industry began. And it used this astonishing plant ash called ushnan. It was a sort of alkaline plant that was found in marshy soil that was very common in Syria. And it produces this beautiful glass which the Venetians then, once the glass industry was destroyed in Damascus by Tamerlane in 1401, and he then runs off with all the craftsmen, takes them off to build Samarkand for him instead. All that technology then passes into Europe, and the Venetians make a monopoly on the island of Murano, but old Venetian recipes still talk about the essential ingredients, and one of them is the cinders of Syria, this wonderful flux of this plant, which makes the glass so malleable and gives it this magnificent sort of texture and depth and mysterious quality when the light shines through it. And so this is Chartres Cathedral, famous for its stained glass windows, and this colour here, this pale, this pale sort of translucent blue there. To this day, nobody knows how that colour is made. It can't be replicated. It hasn't been found. Again, so the skills of how to mix these colours, how to experiment with metals and different elements to produce these colours, the whole skill of alchemy is a very Islamic thing, and the skills pass into Europe through the Islamic world. This is the oldest piece of stained glass in this country, still in situ. So this is 12th century. It's in a tiny village church in Kent called Brabourne. And in the middle there is an archway of the Ibn Tulun Mosque. And if you look, you'll see the interlocking circles. Can you see how the interlocking circles is the pattern? And then in the Ibn Tulun Mosque, again, you get these interlocking circles as a very common Islamic design. But the thing that started me off on all of this was the zigzag. This is where it all began, with a zigzag. 20 years, I've had this 20-year fascination with zigzags that goes back actually to my house in Damascus. I bought a house, an Ottoman courtyard house in the old city of Damascus in 2005. And running around the courtyard was this trio of zigzags. And I asked my Syrian architect and the Syrian craftsman I was working with when we did this 3-year restoration project on the house, what on earth are those zigzags? What is that all about? And nobody knew. They all said, well, we don't know, it's some sort of ancient pattern, but we don't honestly know. So it remained a mystery until my brother said, there's a very interesting documentary, you might want to watch it, called The Secret History of Writing. So I watched it, and it begins with the presenter walking up to a site that I recognized immediately in the Sinai, because I lived in Cairo for 4 years, so I recognized this as somewhere I used to go quite regularly at weekends. It's up high in the mountains, the turquoise mines of the pharaohs, and it's at the temple of Hathor, and there's in this temple the Egyptian hieroglyphs. If you notice there, you see that symbol in the hieroglyphs there and there and there. 3 times it occurs there. And on a neighboring rock face, they found the scribbles, early scribbles of the Canaanite migrant workers who were working on these mines for the pharaohs. And they used the hieroglyphs to develop the very first phonetic script on which all our alphabets are based. And that zigzag, they took the zigzag to make the sound m, because in Arabic and in all the Semitic languages, the word for water is mai or may or mayin, various ways of pronouncing it according to the local dialect. And if you think about it, even our letter M is a sort of small zigzag. So of course, this was my eureka moment. I realized finally the zigzag running around my courtyard was water. And I asked my Syrian architect friend who's living in the house at the moment to send me a photo of how it begins on one side of my Iwan and how it ends on the other side. And this is what he sent me. So it's emerging from a circle, so clearly a spring, and flowing all the way around the courtyard and off into infinity on the other side. So clearly it's water flowing around the house. And my Syrian architect friend got just as excited as I did, rushed off and looked at all the other Ottoman houses in old Damascus. He said, they've all got it. It's everywhere. And of course, Damascus is built on this flowing water, the management of water, where water flows in and out of every house in a continuous way. So then I started to notice the zigzag everywhere in early Islamic art as it passes down. You can track it then down through Coptic architecture and into the first Muslim architecture here with a zigzag. This is Qasr Mushatta, one of the early Umayyad palaces, where the zigzag is running through the garden, if you like, with the flowers and all the vegetation around. And of course, all the salsabil, the public fountains across the Islamic world, have zigzags carved into the surface where the water runs down. So again, it's symbolizing water. This is in Sicily, in one of the Norman palaces. So again, the Normans have taken over this idea of the zigzag. And still in Sicily, this is the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina, done by Fatimid architects, where they're showing a fountain with zigzags carved there, with two musicians on either side. And the Benedictine monastery of Monreale in Palermo in Sicily, there's a fountain in the corner of the cloister covered in zigzags. All the columns are covered in zigzags to show the water flowing down. And then, of course, the zigzag reappears in Durham Cathedral. It's, in this country, this is the first time, and suddenly everybody calls it a Norman invention. It suddenly becomes the Norman zigzag. And you've also got lozenges here on the other pillars. You've got these patterns that nobody understands. People just say, oh, well, these are just remarkable things that the Normans invented without an understanding of the backstory of where these things came from. So this is Bristol Cathedral on the right-hand side, where you've got zigzags running down the chapter house with these little pearl beading that I explained about. So it just looks like water's running down the dome, running down the walls and the ceiling in the most astonishing way. And a cathedral in Italy, again using all these geometric shapes with flowing beading running everywhere, the same patterns you see being used again. And none of this existed in Latin Christendom before. So you see things like this, and you think, well, that's obviously an Islamic pattern, isn't it? Look at the 8-pointed star, look at the moons, the waxing and waning moon and the full moon there. You've got all this interlacing, interweaving. But this is the rose window, the famous rose window in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, built in the early 12th century. And it's become the symbol of Santiago now. You can buy it in all the souvenir shops as a mouse mat, as coasters, as a scarf. It's everywhere, and yet it's so obviously Islamic in its design. And in a German monastery, again, there's the use of the waxing and waning moons, which again people just don't understand where it came from. It's just described as a mystery symbol. And then in France, you start to get 8-pointed stars all over on the apses of cathedrals. This is in the Massif Central. So in central France, you get the alternating ablak with the volcanic stone and then the white limestone. And so, I mean, this could be, it could be a mosque looking at it from the outside. Then you get mosques. So this is a Fatimid mosque. This is actually, I think, Al-Azhar in Cairo, where the courtyard is still original. A lot of the later things, much later Mamluk additions, but the original Fatimid courtyard is still intact, with the slender columns and the use of these medallions and shapes here. And then this other illustration that I gave of this, what gets called in Romanesque art history language, they call this Venetian dentil, because it starts to appear in Venice and in around cathedrals. But this is it a whole century or earlier even in the Rabat of Sousse in modern Tunisia, where it was already in use. But then it starts to appear in Benedictine monasteries like this one in Germany. This is Maria Lach Monastery. It appears here. You've got the use of quatrefoils, you've got lozenges, and you've got this kind of porch in front of the, with the slender columns here. And it's actually called the Paradise, and it has a fountain in the courtyard in the centre there. It's just like a courtyard approach to a mosque. Monasteries in Spain are full of examples of this sort of thing. So on the left is an ablution, could be an ablution fountain in a mosque, but it's actually where the monks washed their hands on their way to the refectory. And there you've got lozenges, you've got the slender columns, you've got all the elements of that we've seen in the Islamic architecture. This is the cloister at Lerida, with all the geometric shapes here, these multifoil arches, the slender columns. This is in Moissac, the cloister in central France. This was a very, very powerful monastery at that time. Again, you've got the lozenges here, and you start to get these capitals, where every capital is different. There's no symmetry at all, but you've got these lovely slender columns alternating, 2 and then 1. And each column is carved with animals or beautiful foliage in a way that's nothing to do with religion at all. This is totally secular carving. This is in Toledo, so this is 10th century under the Cordova of Caliphate, where you see interlocking arches here, a style that's begun in the 10th century. In Islamic architecture, again, lozenges with frames. And then you start to see it, so on the right, that's the outside of the Cordova Mesquita, again with interlocking arches here. And then it appears again in Durham Cathedral, suddenly copying these Islamic arches. This is the Galilee Chapel. The Damascus Umayyad Mosque, you've got these tall, pointed tall arches like this very distinctive shape around the courtyard, and this is early. This is 8th century. But then the Syrians, obviously the Umayyad Syrians, bring all these styles into Spain because they are the offshoot of the Umayyads. So they bring all these styles in from Syria into Spain, and they use them then here with the same tall blind arches running around, and these multifoil shapes around the arches, the ablaq style, which you see all over Syria. And the Fatimids were using the same thing. This is the Al-Hakim Mosque in Cairo. Again, the tall blind arches, the lozenges here on the entrance porch. And then it suddenly appears in Pisa. So you've got the Leaning Tower and you've got the Cathedral of Pisa. You've got the tall blind arches with the lozenges there, again at the bottom of the Tower of Pisa. And this happens just a couple of decades after the Pisans conquer Palermo. So the timing, again, just shows you that this is not local knowledge, because Pisa didn't even have a local school of architecture before this. And then suddenly something like this pops out, which tells you that clearly they have brought in foreign workers at the top of their game with new styles and new technology, but working for new masters, so working to new specifications, if you like. The animals, the use of animals, that is another big characteristic of Romanesque architecture, again goes right back, like the zigzags, into very early civilization. This is the archetypes that you find in Mesopotamia, in Assyria. This is the Gate of Babylon, which you can see in Berlin, the Gate of Ishtar. And you've got this idea of paired animals, fantastical creatures that are not real. There are no creatures like this. But then you get the lions, the use of lions. This is still the gate of Ishtar in Babylon. And this use of frames and flowers running, creating the borders. And then the lions start to, I mean, obviously lions were completely extinct in Europe at this time, but this is now in Sicily under the Normans. The Normans adopt the use of this lion in this stylized pose with the paw up, the right paw up and the tail curling around, facing each other. And this is exactly the pose which then Richard the Lionheart adopts and uses when he comes back from the Crusades as a style that becomes the English coat of arms then. But this posture of the lion was already in use on Fatimid banners of the time in the 10th century. So again, it's found its way in through Islamic patterns. And the fantastical creatures that start to appear on the capitals of Romanesque cathedrals, again, all have their antecedents in very early civilizations. So this one on the left is the Sabian culture in what is modern Yemen, right down in the tip of southern Arabia, where again the quality of stonemasonry there was very, very high. They had a tradition of sculpture, so using griffins like this. And again, the ancient Egyptians had gods who were sort of half animal, half god, this zoomorphic idea, sticking out the tongue there to protect against the evil spirits. And the use of animals and people then, fantastical creatures, is very strong in Spain under the Caliphate of Cordova. So you have ivory carvings here with paired animals, and again you've got the pearl beading linking everything in medallions and frames everywhere, with animals fighting each other or facing away from each other or towards each other, in the same way that fantastical creatures like mermaids. This is a Fatimid piece, which you can see in the Islamic Museum in Cairo, showing again mermaids facing away from each other. And then you start to get this sort of thing appearing on the fronts of cathedrals. So this is on the front of the Lincoln Cathedral. Here you've got the pearl beading around the medallions. You've got the pairs of animals, sometimes facing each other, sometimes facing away from each other. You've got fantastical beasts, and you've got animals entwined in all the foliage, which is a very, very strong Fatimid pattern. And the whole idea of animals, animal fables, the Kalila wa Dimna stories that go right back to the early Sanskrit, but are then translated into Arabic and then come into the Islamic world. There's a whole tradition of the use of animals to kind of represent other things. And so here the lion is the ruler, and he's being given lessons by the small jackal or fox in how to govern. And this is very typical of the sort of sense of humour that comes out in early capitals, in Romanesque cathedrals, in a way that's really quite striking. This whole sort of social satire almost, that the underdog is poking fun at the ruler. And it goes right back into ancient Egyptian times, where the craftsman village in Deir el-Medina, they found examples of where the craftsmen were just sort of having fun, showing cat and mice with role reversal, so that the cats are waiting on the mice, and the mice are in charge of the palace, and the cats are waiting on them. Many examples of this sort of thing with role reversal. This is again another example of the Sabian use of the ibex, where they had friezes carved of stylized, very stylized ibex, which could be the origin of what they call the beakhead in Romanesque architecture, which you get around the arches of cathedrals. This one is in Bayeux in France, where every head is different. Every single head is completely different. There's no symmetry, no attempt at symmetry at all. And then you get this is in Canterbury Cathedral in the crypt, where you get fantastical animals playing instruments in a way that the clergy couldn't understand it at all. They sort of thought, what on earth are these mad animals doing in our churches, and why are they playing instruments? You know, they desperately looked for religious meaning in these capitals when there wasn't any. That they were purely, well, in my view, the masons were having fun. Basically, they were just enjoying themselves using the sort of archetypal patterns that were part of their deeply buried heritage. All of these things which were just instinctive to them. And again, look at the beading here comes out in these little patterns around, and the whole tradition of animals playing instruments goes right back into early Islamic culture. So this, again, in a lozenge frame, is a bear playing a lute in one of the bathhouses of the Umayyad desert palaces. So this one is in Jordan, today's Jordan. So this is, again, 8th century, going right back. And on the right-hand side is a female lute player who appears on the ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo. And again, you've got the lozenge framing around all of the pictorial elements in that ceiling, or each single one is framed with the pearl beading. And then this is Santiago de Compostela. So again, the holiest site of pilgrimage in Latin Christendom. The common theme is Christ in Majesty, the sort of final judgment. And underneath are what's called the 24 elders of the Apocalypse. And each one is clutching his instrument there and looking up at Christ in Majesty. And each one is different. Each face is different. They're all sitting in different positions. You know, their feet are in different positions. Their expressions are different. These are all individuals. This is a very typical way of, in Islamic art, of depicting people as different. So this is another example, for instance, in the Alhambra in Granada. This is the Hall of Kings, where every single king is different, people having animated conversations. This is nothing to do with Byzantine art, where the people are very stylized and static and full frontal. It's a very, very different style, which you can trace back in Islamic art, because Islamic art using people representation was quite common in secular settings, in palaces. It was only in mosques that it wasn't used. So we mustn't imagine that Muslim sculptors and painters weren't capable of doing painting people. They were, and in fact, there was recorded that there were competitions held under the Fatimids, for example, where one artist would say to the caliph, "Oh, my caliph, I can draw you a picture of a dancer coming out of the wall," and then another rival painter would say, "Well, I can do you a picture of a dancer going into the wall," just to show how clever they were at doing movement. All these sorts of styles that nothing in Byzantine painting is remotely like this. It's all completely different. So to end now, just to bring it back up to the modern day, on the left here we have the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, which is still unfinished. It's due to be finished in 2026. And Gaudi, the architect there, openly was influenced by Islamic architecture, and he said, "I am a geometrician, I synthesize." And the Sagrada Familia, what's so remarkable about it is that it's this incredible synthesis of nature and geometry and religion, all sort of organically fused together in a way that's quite astonishing. And again, it hasn't got that sort of regularity of a classical facade. It's as if it's growing naturally out of the ground, because nature doesn't have, conventional right angles. Every leaf is different. So Islamic architecture, in my view, reflects that. And Notre Dame, as you know, Notre Dame is about to reopen after 5 years after the fire. I think it's the 8th of December is the date that's been set. And when it, in both cases here, what's happened is the people working on both of these projects now are multinational, but they are the best. They are the best because the French needed to get people who were fast and highly skilled. So they got them from wherever they could. And so they're not all French by any means. And there have been Muslims working in the restoration of Notre Dame. And I've spoken to one of them who was happy to be interviewed, and I quote him in the book, and he talks about his joy at building a cathedral, because it's not about religion at all, it's about the skill. And this is the point that I'm making, that the pure level of skill is why people were chosen for these top prestige projects. But so back around the year 1100, when Romanesque popped so miraculously out of nowhere, in my view, what the Islamic world gave us at that point, gave us in Europe, I'm talking now, was the essential platform from which all future European styles developed. And I think they deserve acknowledgement for that, because it hasn't been fully recognised in my view, because only they were right at the top of their game at that time with that kind of capability. Now, of course, it's multinational, and now you have to get the best, from all over the world to complete projects like this. So that's the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana. Your presentation sets the mind spinning. I'll start with some questions of my own, and while I do that, people can think about their own. You studied Islamic art and Arabic.
Well, I did my first degree in Arabic, and then much later, after buying my house, actually, that's what deepened my interest in architecture, and I wanted to understand the house at a deeper level. So I went back into the academic world to do an MA in Islamic art and architecture at SOAS. Yeah.
Did you find that limiting in that it wasn't satisfying your sort of curiosity? The thing that made you start doing that, did you think, hang on, there's something that's not being told here?
Absolutely, and I'm afraid my professor, I was always asking the sort of questions that she hated. And because she would show us these images of her speciality was Mamluk Cairo, and so she was always showing us these pictures and describing these mosques. And I would say to her, well, look, I can see that with my own eyes. I can see it's got 2 minarets and that it's got that pattern on the dome. But what I want to know is why? Why was it built like that? And she would never answer that question. She would just sort of say, well, it's just a pattern. And in my view, nothing is just a pattern. Everything has been chosen for a reason, especially in medieval times when people were so imbued with the meanings of patterns. So nothing was chosen just because it was a pretty pattern at all, in my view. But she hated that way of looking at it. She kind of saw it as look, this mosque, has this style, and then this mosque has the next style. So what? That doesn't tell you anything at all.
Did you think that there was a kind of a problem in the way that the kind of Islamic art and architecture was conceptualized and understood within kind of Western academic scenarios? Did you sort of think, hang on, there's a bigger problem here in the way in which Islamic architecture is being
understood? I didn't realise that at the time, because I was new to it at that point. But I've come to that view, yes, that there has been a lack of questioning, basically, and a tendency to assume that all the Arabs ever did was to copy something that was there before. And I think that's very unfair. It's very unfair. Of course, everybody builds on what was there before. So the early Muslims built on the Byzantine heritage and on the Sasanian heritage, but they synthesized that into something new and recognizably different. So, they produced new things, like the pointed arch, like the trefoil arch, all these elements that then come into the cathedrals.
So it was the interconnections between different periods of Islamic architecture and art that you were trying to make the connections between, and also the kind of meanings and symbolisms behind the things that you were looking at. But also there was then this this other kind of, big phenomena that you were looking at, which was the encounter between the Islamic world and the European. Was that also something that you found was understudied or under-described in that traditional academic world? Very
much so, yes. I really did. I found it just wasn't addressed, basically. It's as if everybody wanted to stay within their specialism and not, so somebody was a Byzantine specialist, somebody was an Andalusian specialist, and there was no attempt to link it up.
Yes.
But it's to be honest, I find it quite striking as well in the new Silk Roads exhibition at the British Museum. I've been a couple of times now, and on each occasion I've just thought there's something wrong here in the balance of this exhibition, And then I looked at the curators, and of course there's a Chinese specialist, a Byzantine specialist, and an early European and British specialist, so all the Sutton Hoo stuff. But there is nobody from the Islamic world. And yet the period it's looking at, from the year 500 to the year 1000, is the exact golden age of the Muslim world. And there's no Islamic curator. And that really shows in the exhibition, to my mind. And I think it's actually rather misleading that you go in there, and of course they do mention the Islamic world, but not in the way they should. It ought to have a much more prominent role in that exhibition because it was so major.
Yeah.
It was totally controlling the Mediterranean at that time, for more than half of that time that they're looking at. But somehow it gets sort of skirted out, because of the specialisms. And this is, again, something I didn't understand before, that, of course, any exhibition is really just a reflection of the curator's particular specialisms and the things that they want to push, because those are the things they know about. So again, it's people staying within their field of specialism and not sort of, making the bigger connections.
It's very strange how these forms of knowledge, production and kind of protection, if you like, still persist quite intact, actually, for decades, really, don't they? I mean, these are kind of forms of sort of an organisation of knowledge which have existed for 100 years, if not more, but they still seem to persist. Is Spain a good place to look at the the kind of very sort of real encounter between the Islamic and the Christian world as a sort of almost like a kind of petri dish, if you like?
Spain, northern Spain and Sicily are absolutely eye-opening. I mean, really, goodness me. I mean, on each occasion I've been to Sicily, I just knocks you over. Once, I mean, zigzags, my God, zigzags everywhere.
Yeah.
And the styles, and it's just staring you in the face. Once you see it and you recognize the patterns and you see where they came from, tracing them back. So after I had my zigzag moment, my epiphany, the first thing I wanted to do was to see how the zigzag had passed down, therefore, before it arrived in Sicily and before the Normans brought it here. And so that's why I went to Cairo, to look at the Coptic Fatimid connections. Because again, the Copts is a very understudied area. People don't even know what the Copts are, they're not well written about at all. And the Fatimids, most people have never heard of the Fatimids. These are whole absolutely vital dynasties that and groups of people who were at the top of their game for big chunks of time. And they had the top craftsmen, and the motifs did pass down. You can see it very clearly. If you go to Cairo, you go to the Coptic Museum in the morning, and you go to the Islamic Art Museum in the afternoon, it just, blows your mind, actually. When you go into the museum with that in mind, to see, how do I see these patterns continuing? And if that's what you go in looking for, you'll really see it.
And one of the things that I've always been particularly sort of intrigued by is the way in which the Christian rulers and communities in Spain adopted quite fully Islamic styles and types of forms of making and the architecture almost seamlessly. Is that something that you? That's not necessarily something that we see happening so sort of naturally in other parts of kind of Christian Europe in terms of like that kind of adoption of the Islamic traditions.
I did find, as I mentioned, it's quite difficult to find documented evidence. There's very little because it wasn't recorded a lot of the time. I mean, all these craftsmen are just anonymous masters. You know, there are no names until suddenly you start to get a few Christian names like William of Sens, you know, who's the person credited with bringing the ribbed vaulting from France across into Canterbury Cathedral. But the point I make in the book is, well, for a start, by that stage, you've already had 200 years before that. Where did William of Sens get it from? And also the names themselves. I mean, one of the things that I discovered is, so you get legal documents in Sicily where they talk about Roger, who was once Ahmed. and you get Christians called Muhammad in villages, and there's intermarriage, and the children might take a Christian name, they might take a Muslim name. The whole thing is incredibly blurred and muddled up. And if you think of a Muslim going to work then for a new Christian master and his name is unpronounceable to the Christian master, then, you know, the chances are his name is going to change. He'll adopt a local name or be given a nickname of some sort, just the same as builders are now. You know, you get somebody, Polish builder coming across, you can't begin to pronounce his name, so you call him, we'll call you Nicky instead, you know, I mean, because you recognise that, and people do that in order to fit in. So the names tell you nothing for a start, you know, that's one very important point. Yeah, absolutely, I mean, that's
there was a kind of much more fluidity.
Much more fluidity
than we're told.
Yes, yes. But it's the way everything is anonymous. In the early Romanesque up until the early Gothic, it's all anonymous masters. Nobody, no record at all, no names. And then suddenly, you know, these names start to appear, all of which are names like William, Robert, you know, Roger. But as I say, you can't tell anything from that. Yes. And the other thing that is documented is that even as late as so Ferdinand and Isabella, who complete the Reconquista in 1492 of Spain and Portugal, they go into Zaragoza, they occupy the Jafaria Palace, and they appoint, as the master builder for all the royal palaces in Aragon, a Muslim. They appoint him for life, and the position passes down to his son. Well, why would they do that? Because he's the best, you know. He is the best. Clearly, even that late, nobody in the Christian world could get close to the skill that man had. So they wanted the best. They were the top of the pile. They wanted the best. They didn't care whether he was Muslim, Christian, whatever. They just wanted the best.
Yes, yeah. Are there questions from the audience? Do you want to hog the... Yes.
Thank you so much, Diana, for a fascinating presentation. I was just curious, most of the buildings you showed presentation, they were religious buildings like cathedrals. There were some palaces in Sicily. But in your research, did you find any examples of these artisans working on any palace or cathedrals or even like civic buildings in Britain generally? I just got the sense that, was it because that they were Arabs and Muslims that they were hired to just work on religious buildings as opposed to the secular buildings?
No. They were hired for all the prestige projects. So yes, castles, palaces as well. It's just they're not as recognisable, although frankly the Tower of London is an example, and I show a picture of that in the book. There are over 150 pictures in the book actually that explain what is Islam. And people would say, what's possibly Islamic about the Tower of London? But if you just look at it differently and you look at the detailing and the way these decorative structural lessines, as they're called, come down the corners, and the double windows, you start to see it. Once you actually just change the way you're looking at it. So yes, it's all buildings. The only reason I've chosen cathedrals is because they tend to be more familiar to people, and so they recognise them more, that's all.
There's one there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. I just wanted to ask just two things. How receptive have people been to perhaps other experts who know a lot about this but have previously misattributed some of these features as Norman when hearing your work? And then the other question was just, does the 8-pointed star represent anything specific in Islam?
It does. And my understanding is that it does. I mean, and it comes over into Christianity. I mean, the 8. I mean, I'd be interested to hear your view on this actually too, because I mean, it's another one of these archetypal symbols. It goes, the first place that it's seen, as far as I could discover, is actually in Assyrian sculpture as the symbol of Ishtar. So it's beside the symbol. It's beside Ishtar as a sort of sacred symbol, a sort of protection. But it. What do you feel?
It's a very familiar motif within sort of Islamic geometries. The 8-pointed.
Yes.
And the 8,
but it goes right back.
12, yeah.
I mean, like so many of these patterns, they do actually go right back into the ancient archetypes. But then, as they start to become things associated with specific meanings. And I mean, my understanding is that the 8-pointed star has a sense of definitely a sense of holiness and resurrection and even fertility. I mean, Ishtar is a goddess, you know, who is associated with all of those things, and so
so kind of rooted in all kinds of sort of ancient symbolisms as well.
Yes, I think. But there are specific meanings. I mean, and I don't think somebody could say, yes, the 8-pointed star means X. You know, it's not quite as straightforward as that. It has different meanings, I think, within different contexts where it's used. So, for instance, in the Cambridge Central Mosque,
it was the breath of the compassionate.
The breath of the compassionate, that's right. Now, I'd not heard that before, but that's what Keith Critchlow said, wasn't it? I mean, so again, you know, people who are specialists in this field can see more detail. So, I mean, I think that's very beautiful. The breath of the compassionate is a wonderful.
And it was that geometry that kind of underlied many of the
tile patterns.
The tile patterns.
Yes, on the walls. Yes.
There was a question. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering, in following these various aesthetic and technical threads, is it possible to pinpoint something as more likely to come from Sicily than from Spain, or is that hard to do?
I think it's. I think certainly the metalwork skill is definitely something more in Spain, because I don't think there are mines in Sicily, but they did have this astonishing wood carving ability. Well, that actually they brought the Fatimids in. I mean, so Roger, the Norman king, you know, he brought in Fatimid carpenters, master carpenters, to build the ceiling, because again, you know, there was nobody who could do that except these people who were absolutely at the top of their game, you know, using muqarnas to have an incredible sense of sort of depth to the ceiling, you know, they're sort of endlessly receding as if it was floating up there with phenomenal detail. And yet, you know, so it's in a royal palace, the royal chapel, so it's a religious setting, and yet, you see, actually, when you look at the detail of what these things are, what the people are, they're basically secular. They're scenes from the caliph's court, you know, the entertainment of the. So that's why people are playing musical instruments. There are crazy beasts doing all sorts of, you know, fantastical beasts doing this and that, antics, dancing. It's a scene of courtly entertainment, because that's the tradition that the Fatimids had in that kind of artwork. And actually, it's quite funny when you think about it, that this is a secular scene, But Roger didn't mind, you know. I mean, nobody can see it that clearly anyway, because it's right up in the ceiling. You really need a telescope to, I mean, the only way I've been able to see it really closely is because there's a wonderful book, again, that was done during a restoration. So you've got really detailed pictures, you know, where the whole page gives you a detail, and then you can really see, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
wow, I never knew that's what was, you know, going on up there.
Yeah. I mean, that was quite remarkable, the description that you gave of the animals and the kind of the fables that were being somehow portrayed within
and you see the clergy, there was this very famous clergyman called Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a co-founder of the Templars and was later made a saint. He founded the Cistercians, which were a breakaway from the Benedictines. You know, it's a very, very important guy. I mean, he preached the Second Crusade, and he was furious about all these animals in the cloisters. He said, you know, he this famous sermon that he gives where he says, "What are these ridiculous animals doing in our cloisters, distracting us from our prayers?" You know, well, this is proof that you know, they had no religious meaning, nothing that the church could understand in what was going on in these. But you know, even me saying that, I know people will hate me saying that sort of thing about their, you know, because they're determined to see some sort of crazy religious meaning there, you know, however preposterous it is, and I give a few examples of some of the more preposterous ones in the book.
Yeah, the idea of these kind of fantastical beasts, kind of, and because you kind of related them to sort of Sanskrit theology.
Again, what the clergy do is say, oh well, these beasts come in because of the medieval bestiaries, they say, you know, and which are used. But where did these bestiaries come from? Well, you know, I'm explaining that actually all of these medieval bestiaries didn't just pop out like that at around the year 1100. They appear because the tradition is there, brought in through the Islamic world, of animals, you know, used slightly social satire, like, you know, slightly poking fun at their masters. I mean, actually, the Egyptian sense of humour is still like that now.
Yeah,
it's quite striking, actually, that some of these things are really quite deep in the psyche.
So is it almost as if the builders of the cathedrals and churches and you know, religious buildings and courtly buildings and so on, is it almost as if the builders themselves contained the knowledge? They were imbuing the architecture with meaning, almost outside of the control of the patrons.
Well, I mean, the bishops would no doubt have said, I want my cathedral to be this size, you know, and would have decided on the plot. And so the actual dimensions would have been laid down.
Right.
So, of course, the craftsmen would follow that. They would make it the shape that was required, you know, the long, thin shape. And they would, you know, build it to the specifications of the patron, the financer of the building. And they would, no doubt also, the bishop would say, I would like a picture of Christ in majesty here above the doorway, and I'd like the biblical scenes. But again, you know, all these biblical scenes are familiar to Muslim sculptors. I mean, Mary is mentioned more times in the Quran than she is in the Bible. You know, I mean, all of this stuff is part of the Muslim tradition as well. All these biblical stories, a lot of them are from the Old Testament. That's the other thing that's very striking in Romanesque cathedrals. So you've got Noah and the flood, you've got, you know, Abraham and Isaac. You know, all of these things are completely normal in the Muslim tradition as well. So nothing odd about. It wouldn't be difficult for a top Muslim sculptor to make images like that.
Sure.
And then, of course, the bishop would always want himself in there too. So always, you know, a nice statue of me, preferably prominently, you know, by the doorway sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they did that as well.
Yes.
Although that's also quite funny because in Moissac, the one that I mentioned, which is the number 2 most powerful after Cluny. You know, Cluny is the big powerhouse, the big Benedictine powerhouse. In Moissac, there is the bishop there. They put him there right in the centre of the, which is almost certainly where he asked to be, in the most prominent place as you enter the cloister. But my goodness, he looks he looks dour, you know. And apparently, again, I researched this a little bit. Apparently, he was really unpopular as a man, and it's as if they took their sort of revenge on him by saying, "Okay, you want to be in it? Here you are. You know, this is what you look like."
Yeah. So the sort of power of the makers. Any more questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that really enlightening talk. I just want to say that, you know, in the world that we live in today, with all the horrible things going around, it's actually really nice to have that connection with the Muslim world. But I just wanted to ask that, are you the first one to have made that connection between, you know, sort of the great European buildings and the Islamic architecture?
To be perfectly honest, I can't understand why other people haven't done this before me. What people have done, academics, if they've studied like one building or something like that, you know, in the way that academics do, they sort of go into massive detail on one building. So I mentioned that. I mean, the book is fully footnoted and sourced and everything. And so, you know, somebody, for instance, you know, studies 2 churches in southern Italy and looks at the way they've been built and compares them to mosques and says, and works out that the chances are that these churches were built by local Muslims. And of course, southern Italy was full, it wasn't just Sicily, southern Italy was also under Arab control until the Normans you know, finally kicked them out. But so, I mean, I honestly don't know why somebody hasn't written this book before me. I honestly don't know. And it's as if, I don't know, I mean, you know, I mean, the more I look now, I'm drowning in material, honestly. I mean, I had such a job to fit it into one volume. There's just so much. Everywhere I went, I just saw more and more and more. And you just think, my God, you know, and then once you see it, it really hits you. And
I mean, what guided your sort of research, if you like, or what guided you from one place to the other?
The zigzag. The zigzag was the key. As I said, once I saw the zigzag, I thought, my goodness, you know, what if the zigzag is just the tip of the iceberg, and actually all these other motifs that are associated with Romanesque, all the things that are credited as Romanesque inventions, what if they too are? So that's what I started looking for.
Right.
So I looked at the things that are described as Romanesque, like those tall blind arches that you get in Pisa. You know, this is a constant thing that you get. Tall blind arches, this use of beading, this Venetian dentil, these delicate arcades, the slender columns, the vaulting. And then, of course, even during Romanesque, the arch becomes pointed. It doesn't miraculously become pointed under Gothic, although that's, you know, again, in a sort of very oversimplified way, a lot of people think about it as, oh, Gothic means pointed and Romanesque means round arch. It's really not that simple at all. It's a blend, you know, it's a transition over a couple of centuries, actually.
Any other questions? Yeah, was one. Oh, sorry, do that one there, and then we'll.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I feel like we've been on such a journey this evening, and really great storytelling and really a real trip through history. Thank you so much. Some of the architecture you showed in the cathedrals, I think a lot of people would say looks maybe like Celtic geometry, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, now again, I go into this in the book because, again, so much is credited as Celtic or Celtic, yes. And what I discovered is that many things, actually. That, well, for a start, the Irish monks went to Egypt very early on, and, you know, they were sent to Egypt because the monasticism began in the Egyptian desert. You know, the Desert Fathers was in Egypt and in Syria. So they went there to learn how to build monasteries, because they didn't know how to build monasteries. Where it all began was in Egypt and Syria. So Irish monks went from Iona and places like that to Egypt, brought back the styles, and this sort of interlacing patterns. If you look at Fatimid art and Coptic art, it's exactly like that. And the Irish high crosses, as they're called, is very clearly modelled on the ancient Egyptian ankh, the symbol of life. You know what I'm talking about? That symbol, the sort of thing that looks a bit like a key.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, even the things that are carved on the Irish high crosses, you can trace them back. So there's this thing about beard pulling that goes on, and again, people thought, what on earth is going on there, But again, there's this tradition of beard pulling. It's part of courtly entertainment, going right back to Egypt. And so, in my view, it's just found its way in through this. And maybe the Irish monks brought back one or two craftsmen with them, to show them how to do it, because it's not that easy, you can't just get up and start thinking, oh well, I'll build a nice pointed arch here and a cloister or two. It takes a lot of experience, generations and generations of skill to do this.
I'm losing track of time because I've kind of got immersed in this conversation. There's one. Is there one last? Got time for one very short one, and then one last question.
Just quickly. So I love your work, and it's really problematic. This living here in the West, and people not recognizing that the link to the Islamic world, and the way that you've shown it. Really, you quoted somewhere that in this sort of age that we live in, with the rising Islamophobia, that it was a really important piece of work to do as well. So I thought that was really important. The second thing was that in your acknowledgements, you quoted my mum. And so she was, you said on Twitter you met her, and then she told you about Ipswich Man.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could tell us that story from your perspective, because we haven't really been taking it in from her.
Ipswich Man? Yeah.
I'm wondering whether, how long have we got? Because I'm wondering whether this needs to be a conversation over tea and refreshments. Shall we do that? Yeah. Should we carry on? And okay, you want to make one last comment, but the answer will be over tea. Is that okay?
Could you just say something about that image there? And
the cover. Yes. No. Again, it's been chosen with great care. What it is, this is St. Benedict.
When was it made?
1505. It's an Italian Renaissance painter called Il Sodoma, and it's a fresco in a Benedictine monastery in Tuscany, in Italy. It's still there. You can go and see it. It's one of a series, and it was painted. It was a commission that the artist painted, and what it's showing is the title of it is St. Benedict Founds 12 Monasteries. And what I found immediately so funny about it is, apart from the fact that coincidentally Benedict's stick is pointing at the word Islamesque, which is just a little sort of a sort of joke, if you like. But the scene itself of Benedict founding the monasteries. So in other words, the credit is always given to the bishop. So you'll read, Bishop X built Lincoln Cathedral, and Bishop Y built Canterbury Cathedral, and of course it wasn't the bishops at all. They paid the money. That they were the impetus, but the actual builders, the craftsmen, were anonymous. But here, this scene of the craftsman. So this is the mason here, and in the actual image, it's been zoomed in for the cover. But over here, all his tools are laid out, and one of his tools is a bow drill, and I talk a lot about the bow drill in the book, and the work on Wells Cathedral front, the drill work as it's called. This Jerry Sampson guy, who's the specialist, says it's phenomenal. The drill work is like nothing he's ever seen, anywhere. And so you've got him, the mason down below. You've got the they're working in the rafters up there. You've got people up in the top, and they all look foreign to my eye, they all look foreign. And I showed this image to a stonemason friend of mine who works on churches, and he said, "This, you can tell that this is taken from a real building site." So obviously, St. Benedict, who was, in the 6th century or whatever, is made up, but the building site is real. He said, "You can tell from the scaffolding." And so that to me was really interesting, because when in 1505 the Italian Renaissance artist painted that, he actually saw these people looking like this, doing this work in this cathedral where it was being painted. So the only completely fictional thing is St. Benedict himself. He's obviously being put in to the image. But that's why we chose it, because it shows the craftsmen at work. And the craftsmen all look foreign. I mean, he looks, North African or Arab, to my eye anyway. I mean, you can't prove it, but if that's, I think, and then of course we chose the beading, the pearl beading round the medallion, just again as a little touch. So I really like the cover, actually. I think it's
kind of further evidence of
the
clues.
Further evidence.
We'll have to stop. Sorry, we can find out about Ipswich Man over to you, if that's okay. And one announcement: on the 14th of December, there is an upcoming event here, Echoes of Love Turkish Music Concert. Join me in thanking Diana. I mean, fantastic. Yeah.